Section 15 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 3 by Henry Gray. The internal carotid artery, Arteria carotis interna. The internal carotid artery supplies the anterior part of the brain, the eye and its appendages, and sends branches to the forehead and nose. Its size in the adult is equal to that of the external carotid, though in the child it is larger than that vessel. It is remarkable for the number of curvatures that it presents in different parts of its course. It occasionally has one or two flexures near the base of the skull, while in its passage through the carotid canal and along the side of the body of the sphenoid bone, it describes a double curvature and resembles the italic letter S. Course and relations. In considering the course and relations of this vessel, it may be divided into four portions: cervical, petrous, cavernous, and cerebral. Cervical portion. This portion of the internal carotid begins at the bifurcation of the common carotid, opposite the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, and runs perpendicularly upward, in front of the transverse processes of the upper three vertebrae, to the carotid canal in the petrous portion of the temporal bone. It is comparatively superficial at its commencement, where it is contained in the carotid triangle, and lies behind and lateral to the external carotid, overlapped by the sternocleidomastoideus and covered by the deep fascia, platysma, and integument. It then passes beneath the parotid gland, being crossed by the hypoglossal nerve and the digastricus and stylohyoideus, and the occipital and posterior auricular arteries. Higher up, it is separated from the external carotid by the styloglossus and stylopharyngeus, the tip of the styloid process, and the stylohyoid ligament, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the pharyngeal branch of the vagus. It is in relation, behind, with the longus capitis, the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk, and the superior laryngeal nerve. Laterally, with the internal jugular vein and vagus nerve, the nerve lying on a plane posterior to the artery. Medially, with the pharynx, superior laryngeal nerve, and ascending pharyngeal artery. At the base of the skull, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves lie between the artery and the internal jugular vein. Petrous portion. When the internal carotid artery enters the canal in the petrous portion of the temporal bone, it first ascends a short distance, then curves forward and medialward, and again ascends as it leaves the canal to enter the cavity of the skull between the lingula and the petrosal process of the sphenoid. The artery lies at first in front of the cochlear and tympanic cavity. From the latter cavity it is separated by a thin bony lamella, which is cribriform in the young subject, and often partially absorbed in old age. Farther forward it is separated from the semilunar ganglion by a thin plate of bone, which forms the floor of the fossa for the ganglion and the roof of the horizontal portion of the canal. Frequently this bony plate is more or less deficient, and then the ganglion is separated from the artery by fibrous membrane. The artery is separated from the bony wall of the carotid canal by a prolongation of dura mater, and is surrounded by a number of small veins and by filaments of the carotid plexus, derived from the ascending branch of the superior cervical ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. Cavernous portion. In this part of its course, the artery is situated between the layers of the dura mater, forming the cavernous sinus, but covered by the lining membrane of the sinus. It at first ascends toward the posterior clinoid process, then passes forward by the side of the body of the sphenoid bone, and again curves upward on the medial side to the anterior clinoid process, and perforates the dura mater, forming the roof of the sinus. This portion of the artery is surrounded by filaments of the sympathetic nerve, and on its lateral side is the abducent nerve. Cerebral portion. Having perforated the dura mater on the medial side of the anterior clinoid process, the internal carotid passes between the optic and oculomotor nerves to the anterior perforated substance at the medial extremity of the lateral cerebral fissure, where it gives off its terminal or cerebral branches. Peculiarities. The length of the internal carotid varies according to the length of the neck, and also according to the point of bifurcation from the common carotid. It arises sometimes from the arch of the aorta. In such rare instances, this vessel has been found to be placed nearer the middle line of the neck than the external carotid, as far upward as the larynx, when the latter vessel crossed the internal carotid. The course of the artery, instead of being straight, may be very tortuous. A few instances are recorded in which this vessel was altogether absent. In one of these, the common carotid passed up the neck and gave off the usual branches of the external carotid. The cranial portion of the internal carotid was replaced by two branches of the internal maxillary, which entered the skull through the foramen rotundum and foramen ovale, and joined to form a single vessel. Branches. The cervical portion of the internal carotid gives off no branches. Those from the other portions are: from the petrous portion, keraticotympanic, artery of the pterygoid canal; from the cavernous portion, cavernous, hypophyseal, semilunar, anterior meningeal, ophthalmic; from the cerebral portion, anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, posterior communicating, choroidal. 1. The keraticotympanic branch. Ramus keraticotympanicus. Tympanic branch is small. It enters the tympanic cavity through a minute foramen in the carotid canal, and anastomosis is the anterior tympanic branch of the internal maxillary and with the stylomastoid artery. 2. The artery of the pterygoid canal. Arteria canalis pterygoidae, Vidian artery, is a small, inconstant branch which passes through the pterygoid canal and anastomosis with the branch of the internal maxillary artery. 3. The cavernous branches are numerous small vessels, which supply the hypophysis, the semilunar ganglion, and the walls of the cavernous and inferior petrosal sinuses, some of them anastomosed with branches of the middle meningeal. 4. The hypophyseal branches are one or two minute vessels supplying the hypophysis. 5. The semilunar branches are small vessels to the semilunar ganglion. 6. The anterior meningeal branch, Arteria meningia anterior, is a small branch which passes over the small wing of the sphenoid to supply the dura mater of the anterior cranial fossa. It anastomoses with the meningeal branch from the posterior ethmoidal artery. 7. The ophthalmic artery, arteria ophthalmica, arises from the internal carotid just as that vessel is emerging from the cavernous sinus on the medial side of the anterior clinoid process, and enters the orbital cavity through the optic foramen, below and lateral to the optic nerve. It then passes over the nerve to reach the medial wall of the orbit, and thence horizontally forward, beneath the lower border of the obliqua superior, and divides it into two terminal branches, the frontal and the dorsal nasal. As the artery crosses the optic nerve, it is accompanied by the nasociliary nerve, and is separated from the frontal nerve by the rectus superior and the levator palpebrae superioris. Branches. The branches of the ophthalmic artery may be divided into an orbital group distributed to the orbit and the surrounding parts, and an ocular group to the muscles and bulb of the eye. Orbital group: lacrimal, supraorbital, posterior ethmoidal, anterior ethmoidal, medial palpebral, frontal, dorsal nasal. Ocular group: central artery of the retina, short posterior ciliary, long posterior ciliary, anterior ciliary, muscular. The lacrimal artery, arteria lacrimalis, arises from the optic foramen, and is one of the largest branches derived from the ophthalmic. Not infrequently, it is given off before the artery enters the orbit. It accompanies the lacrimal nerve along the upper border of the rectus lateralis, and supplies the lacrimal gland. Its terminal branches, escaping from the gland, are distributed to the eyelids and conjunctiva. Of those supplying the eyelids, two are of considerable size, and are named the lateral palpebral arteries. They run medialward in the upper and lower lids respectively, and anastomose with the medial palpebral arteries, forming an arterial circle in its situation. The lacrimal artery gives off one or two zygomatic branches, one of which passes through the zygomatico-temporal foramen to reach the temporal fossa, and anastomoses with the deep temporal arteries. Another appears on the cheek through the zygomatico-facial foramen, and anastomoses with the transverse facial. A recurrent branch passes backward through the lateral part of the superior orbital fissure to the dura mater, and anastomoses with the branch of the middle meningeal artery. The lacrimal artery is sometimes derived